Delia Bohannon did not look at the men when she bid. She kept her eyes on the mare, and she said the number once in an ordinary voice, the way a person says a price for eggs. And then she stood there, with her hands folded in front of her apron, and let 41 men in the yard behind Emmett Vor's store at Satley decide for themselves what kind of a woman would give $6 for the horse that killed Pruitt. It was the 29th of September, 1888. The Cross H was selling off what it did not want to feed through the winter, and the sale had run since 10 in the morning, and by 4 o'clock there was nothing left in the pen but a broken hay rake, 2 crates of stove bolts, and one big blue-gray mare standing in the corner with her head down and one hind foot cocked, looking at nothing, waiting. She was a grulla. That is a color a great many people in that country had never seen and could not name, and the ones who could name it usually got it wrong. She was the color of a dove's back, or of smoke standing still over a fire that has gone out. A soft mouse gray through the body that went dark as slate along the spine, with a black stripe running the whole length of her back from the withers to the tail, black legs from the knees down, a black mane and a black tail, and a face so dark it was nearly black, with a pale mealy ring around the muzzle. There were faint, dark bars across her forearms, the way a wild thing is barred. She stood 16 hands, and she weighed 1,340 pounds on the scale at the Tolman Stock Yards. And there was not one soft place on her anywhere. She had a chest on her like the front of a barn. She was 7 years old that fall. She was, by every measure, a man in Dunmire County knew how to take, the best-made work animal in the pen, and she had gone through the ring 4 times that afternoon with no bid at all. "Now I have got to sell this mare," the auctioneer said. His name was Loman Peel, and he came up from Tolman for these things, and he was tired, and he wanted his supper. "Mr. Pruitt has instructed me she is to be sold, and she is going to be sold. Sound as $1, 7-year-old, halter broke, harness broke to ride, no vice in her mouth, no ring bone, no side bone, teeth to prove her age." Gentlemen, nobody said anything. 41 men and 9 women stood around a plank fence in the low yellow light and looked at their boots. "She will pull," Loman Peel said. "She will pull anything you hook her to." "Till she won't," a man said. The man was Evo Mattoon, who freighted out of Satley with 12 mules and a pair of high-wheeled wagons, and he said it easily. The way a man says a thing he knows the whole room already agrees with, and there was a small laugh that went along the fence and came back. "She quit at the Loop," Mattoon said. "She quit on the bank at Gower's Crossing on the 4th of August, with a man's whole outfit behind her, and she stood there like a post, and she would not put a foot in that water. And Pruitt did the only thing a man could do, and Pruitt is in the ground at Satley. That is the horse. Loman, you can talk about her teeth all evening. I am obliged to sell her. Then sell her to the soapworks and let us go home." And that was when Delia Bohannon said $6. Loman Peel looked up. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to, because he was a decent man, and because he understood immediately what was about to happen to her, and then he looked out over the yard and did his job. $6 is bid. 6, do I hear 7? 7, somebody give me 7. Nobody gave him 7. "Sold to Mrs. Bohannon at $6, he said, and he wrote it in the book, and he wrote her name wrong, with 2 N's and no H, and that misspelled line is still the only piece of paper anywhere in Dunmire County that records the whole thing, and it does not record any of it." She walked into the pen with a halter over her shoulder. She did not hurry, and she did not talk to anybody. Hal Pruitt was standing at the gate, with his hat in his hand and his coat over his arm, a wide sunburned. black-browed man of 46 who had buried his brother 8 weeks before, and she had to pass within 3 feet of him going in, and within 3 feet of him coming out, and he did not move, and he did not speak, and she did not ask him to. She put the halter on the mare. The mare turned her head and put her nose against Delia's shoulder and breathed on her once, and then walked out of that pen at the end of a lead rope as quiet as a milk cow, past 41 men who had just watched a thing they were going to be telling for 3 years. If you have got this far and you want to know how it came out, stay with me, and subscribe if you have a mind to. Because that gray mare walking out of the sale pen at Satley is the one this whole thing turns on, and I want you here when this county finds out what it was looking at. Delia Bohannon was 30 years old that fall, and she had been a widow for a year and a half. Her husband Reese had freighted and hayed, and broke a little ground on 640 acres of Sandhill Meadow on Spring Branch, 11 miles northwest of Satley, and in the January of 1887 he had gone to Tolman with a load and come back wet and been dead of lung fever by the 9th of March. He was a mild, careful, well-liked man, and he left her the place, 4 horses, a set of harness, a mowing machine with a cracked pitman, and a debt of $220 at Vor's store, which she paid off in pieces over the next 4 years, and which she never once mentioned to anybody. She had a long face and a straight back and black hair she wore in a heavy braid, pinned up under her hat. And she wore a faded blue prairie dress with a cream apron over it, because that was what she had, and her sleeves were rolled and her forearms were brown to the elbow, and there was always dirt worked into the creases of her hands that would not come out for church. She was not a talker. That was the first thing anybody said about her, and it was the last thing too. And it was the truest thing anybody in that country ever noticed about her, and it cost her more than the $6 did. She lived with her father. Zenas Halcomb was 71 that year, and he had been a bullwhacker on the Nebraska City Road before the war, and after that a freighter, and after that a man who got things out of holes. That was his actual trade for 18 years. When a wagon went to the axle in a slough, when a threshing engine dropped a wheel through a culvert, when a bridge pile had to come up out of the river bottom, somebody sent for Zenas Halcomb, and he came with a wagon full of rope and plank and iron, and he got it out, and he charged for it, and he was never once in his life in a hurry. His hands had gone bad in 1885. The knuckles swelled and turned and would not close, and by 1888 he could not tie a bowline or hold a hook, and he sat on the bench outside the harness room in the sun and told his daughter what to do with her hands. And she did it, and between the two of them they made about 3/4 of one whole man. They had 9 head of horses on the place, 2 bay geldings named Cap and Bishop, a stout old sorrel mare named Peach, 4 young things coming 3 and 4 that were not broke to anything yet, 1 blind mule, and now the grulla. And they had a trade. It was not a trade anybody would have chosen, and it was not a trade any man in that country wanted, which is exactly why Delia Bohannon had it. In the sandhills there is water under everything. The meadows between the hills sit on it. In the wet spots along the lake margins and the spring branches, the sod goes soft in a way you cannot see from a horse, and cattle walk out on it after the green feed, and go down to the belly and stick there. And once a cow is bogged, she will fight herself deeper in about 4 minutes, and then she will lie still and wait. And every spring in that country there are men riding the wet meadows, looking for the ones that are stuck. They call it riding bog. Getting them out is the other half of it, and it is the half nobody likes, because it is cold, and it is filthy, and it takes tools most men do not own, and patience most men do not have, and the ordinary way of doing it: a saddle horse, a rope on the horns, and a dally around the horn tears the animal up as often as it saves her. Delia Bohannon charged $2 a head, and she got them out whole. She had the tools because her father had them, She had the patience because she had been raised by a man who did not own a watch. Now, about the night of the 4th of August. I am going to tell it the way Dunmire County told it, because the way Dunmire County told it is the thing this story is actually about. Rand Pruitt was 26 years old, and he was the younger of the two Pruitt boys, and he was the one everybody liked. Hal was the one who ran the outfit and counted the money and told men no. Rand was the one who came to the dances and remembered your dog's name and got down off his horse to help you load. He had been going to marry a girl from Broken Bow in the spring. On the 4th of August, 1888, he took a wagon and 4 head to Gower's crossing on the Middle Loup with a load of cedar posts for the north fence. In the evening, because it had been hot all day and he wanted to travel in the cool. The near leader was the grulla mare, which the Cross-H had bought that June out of a bunch of grade mares and had used exactly 11 times. At Gower's crossing there is a sandbar that runs out from the north bank in a long tongue, and the water over it is about 18 inches deep in August. And there was a set of wagon ruts going down into it that a man could have followed with his eyes shut. The mare stopped at the top of the bank. There were 2 men with him, a hand named Curly Sipe, who was 17 at the time, and an old fellow named Ab Doran, who is where most of this account comes from. Both of them said the same thing, and they said it the same way for the rest of their lives. She did not shy. She did not rear. She did not fight the lines. She stopped with her front feet at the edge of the cut where the ruts went down, and she put her head down, and she stood, and when Rand clucked to her she did not move, and when he slapped the lines on her she did not move, and when he got down and took her by the bit and put his weight into it, she leaned back against him with all one. 340 pounds, and she did not move. He was not cruel to her. Everybody agreed on that too. He took her out of the lead, and he put her on the offside behind, and he brought Ab Doran's brown gelding up into the lead, and the brown gelding walked down the bank into the water like a gentleman, and about 9 feet out from the edge, the whole team dropped through the bar into the running sand under it, and the wagon went down to the box in about the time it takes to say it. Rand Pruitt went in after his horses. That is what a man does. It is the first thing and the worst thing that a man in that country does. He went in with his knife out to cut the tugs and get their heads free, and the sand took him at the same time it took them. And he got 2 of them loose, and he did not come out, and they found him at daylight 300 yards downstream. They got the brown gelding out. They got the near wheeler out. They did not get the wagon out until October. And by the middle of August, there was a sentence going around Dunmire County that had already hardened into the shape it was going to keep. It was not a lie, and nobody said it to be cruel. It went like this. If that gray mare had walked when he told her to walk, Rand Pruitt would be alive. Which is true. It is perfectly true. That is the trouble with it. Delia Bohannon led the mare home 11 miles in the dark and put her in the corral by the harness room and stood on the bottom rail looking at her while her father came out with a lantern. Zenas Halcombe held the light up and walked around the mare twice, slowly, on his bad hip, and looked at her feet and her hocks and the set of her shoulder, and did not touch her, because he could not. "What did you give?" he said. $6. For that? For that? He laughed once, and then he stopped laughing. "Delia," he said, "you know what they are going to say. They said it in the yard. I heard all of it. They are going to say it for years. I expect they will." He put the lantern down on the post and looked at the mare a while longer, and the mare looked back at him with her ears forward, perfectly calm, a big, quiet, dark-faced animal, standing in a strange corral 11 miles from anywhere she knew. She stood on a bank and would not go in the river, he said, and every man in this county knows exactly what that means. And not one of them has gone and looked at that bank. "No, have you?" "I went on the 11th. Delia said. I went and I stood in it. And? There is a spring comes in under the north bar, she said. You cannot see it. There is no color on the water, and there is no boil on it. But when you stand on that tongue about 9 feet out from the cut, the sand goes to nothing under your feet in about 4 seconds, and I got out of it because I was on foot, and I had hold of a willow. Zenas Halcombe stood there in the dark with his ruined hands in his coat pockets. Then, she didn't quit, he said. No, Pa, she read it. Yes, well, he said. You will never make one man in this county believe that as long as you live, and you had better understand that tonight and not find it out slow. He picked the lantern back up. What are you going to call her? Delia Bohannon looked at the color of her in the lantern light, the soft gray through the barrel and the black running down the spine, and she said the first thing that came into her head, which was a joke, and which stopped being a joke inside of 2 years and stayed serious for the rest of the century. Dove, she said. She had the mare 60 days before she understood what she had bought. It took that long because there was nothing to find out. That was the thing that kept confusing her all through that first winter. She kept setting traps for the vice, and the vice did not come. She hitched her single to a stone boat and drove her over frozen ground and through drifts and down the cut bank into Spring Branch and up the other side, and the mare went. She hitched her double with Cap and hauled hay off the meadow in December, and the mare walked into the collar and leaned, and the load came, every time, without a jump and without a grunt, and when the sled hung up on a hummock, the mare did not lunge at it the way a horse will. She set her feet and she leaned harder, and she kept leaning, and she leaned until it came loose, and then she walked on. That is a rarer thing than people who have never worked horses understand. Most horses, when a load will not start, throw themselves at it. They snatch. They jump into the collar and hit the end of the tugs and bounce back and jump again. And they break single trees and neck yokes, and they break their own shoulders doing it. And a teamster spends half his life trying to teach a horse not to. A horse that leans and holds and simply keeps adding weight is worth 2 of any other horse in the world for the kind of work Delia Bohannon did. And there is no way on earth to buy one, because you cannot make a horse do it. They either have it in them or they do not. Dove had it the way water has wet. She's not honest, Zenas Halcombe said, sitting on his bench in the January sun with a horse blanket over his knees, watching her back the mare into the shafts. Honest ain't the word. A honest horse tries. She don't try. She just gets bigger. By the end of January, Delia had used her on every job on that place and on 4 jobs off it, and the mare had refused her exactly twice. The first was on the 14th of November, on the wood road down to the Loup bottom, on a piece of side hill about 40 rods above Ab Doran's fence, in a place where 100 loads had gone over that fall. Dove stopped with the sled behind her and would not take another step, and Delia sat there for 11 minutes and then got down and walked ahead. 50 feet on, the whole shoulder of the road had let go under the snow. There was a crack in the sod 8 inches wide that you could not see from behind a horse because the snow had bridged it, and 40 feet of the outside edge of that road went down into the draw 2 days later when the thaw came. The second was on the 6th of January at the corral gate in a foot of new snow. Nothing under the snow at all. Nothing anywhere. Delia dug the whole gateway out with a spade down to the frozen ground, and there was no hole and no ice and no wire and no reason on this earth. And Dove stood there with her ears forward and would not walk through it. And finally, Delia opened the small gate on the other side, and the mare walked through that one without a hitch and went and stood at the water tank. She never did learn what that one was. She wrote it down as a refusal anyway, because a thing you do not understand is still a thing that happened, and because her father had taught her that the ones you throw out are always the ones that turn out to matter. That is where the pegs came from. On the inside wall of the harness room, on the left as you came in. There was a strip of 2-inch oak that had been screwed there by somebody before Bohannon to hang collars on. Delia bored it out with a brace and put a row of hardwood pegs in it, and every time the mare refused, she cut a scrap off the end of a piece of latigo and burned the date into it with a wire and hung it on a peg. It was not a ledger, and she was not a woman for ledgers. It was just a thing to look at. But it meant that when a man said that mare balks, she could stand in her own harness room and count. There were 2 pegs hung that first winter, and there were 19 of them on the wall on the morning the story ends, and 19 refusals in 3 years is not a balky horse. It is about 1 refusal for every 160 times she was hitched. Delia Bohannon knew that number in her hands long before she ever said it out loud to anybody, and the whole trouble of her life for 3 years is that she never did say it out loud to anybody, and I want you to hold on to that, because it is not a small thing, and it is not the horse's fault. The rest of that winter was rope. You have to understand what her father had been. Zenas Halcomb had come up the Nebraska City Road with bull teams when there were no bridges anywhere between the Missouri and the mountains, and he had spent his working life on the exact problem of how one animal and one man get a thing out of a place it does not want to come out of. And he had thought about it the way a preacher thinks about Scripture. He could not hold a rope anymore. So he taught her. He taught her that everything in the trade comes down to one sentence, which is that a pull is a fight between the weight you can put behind a rope and the ground you have put it on, and the ground wins 9 times out of 10, because men do not think about it at all. He taught her the buried plank. When you have nothing to pull against, and in the sandhills you have nothing to pull against, no rock, no timber, no stump, nothing but grass over sand for 40 miles, you dig a trench 4 feet deep, and you set a 6-foot plank of 2-inch oak on its edge, in the bottom of it, crossways to your pull, and you lead your rope out of the bottom of the trench through a channel so that the strain comes horizontal and not up, and then you fill the trench in and tramp it, and that plank will hold 3 tons in loose sand and never move. Dig it wrong, run your rope up over the lip, and it will come out of there like a cork. He taught her the blocks. She had 2 of them, a double and a single, off a wrecked derrick that Reese had bought for $1 at a bankrupt sale, and rove with a 3/4-inch manila. The pair gave her a purchase of 3-to-1. Which meant a mare who could put 1,300 pounds against a collar became, on the end of that tackle, something that would move nearly 2 tons, at the cost of walking 3 feet for every 1 foot the load came. He taught her that the whole trade is that trade. You buy force with distance. There is nothing else in it. He taught her about suction, which is the part nobody knows. A cow in a bog is not held by mud. She is held by the fact that there is no air under her, and the whole weight of the atmosphere is standing on top of her. And if you pull her straight up, you are lifting the sky. So you do not pull straight up. You dig a channel in beside a hind leg with a narrow spade, and you let the water in, and you rock her, and you work the leg, and you hear it. There is a sound when the ground lets go of an animal, a long, soft, sucking sigh, and once you have heard it, you will hunt for it for the rest of your life. And then and only then do you take the strain, low and flat and slow, along the ground, and never, ever, in a jerk. A jerk is a lie, Zenas said. It tells the rope it is over when it ain't. Rope believes you. Rope is the only honest thing in this business, and you can lie to it exactly once. And he taught her the sentence she was going to have to live through, though neither of them knew it that winter. She had come in one afternoon in February, arguing about a soft place on the meadow road, saying she had dug it, and there was sand a foot down, and it would carry a load. Her father looked at her for a while. "How much did you weigh when you dug it?" "Pa." "How much did the spade weigh?" "I know what you are going to say." "Then I will say it anyway, because you will need it later, and you ain't going to have me." He shifted on the bench. Ground don't answer a shovel, Delia. It answers weight. You can dig a hole in a thing all day, and all you have learned is what a hole looks like. Put a load on it, and it will tell you the truth in 1 second, and it don't never lie. The bog year started on the 2nd of April, 1889, in a wet meadow on the south side of Tobe Artery's place, with a 5-year-old cross-H cow standing into the top of her shoulders in what had looked, that morning, like grass. Tobe Artery was 38 that spring, and he was a hayman. He owned 2 mowing machines, a sulky rake, a stacker, and about 1.5 miles of the best sub-irrigated meadow in Dunmire County, and he put up hay on shares for 4 outfits, including the Cross-H, and he was so quiet that men who had known him 10 years would sometimes forget he was in the room and say things they were sorry about later. He had a long jaw and pale eyes, and he took his hat off indoors, and he had never in his life told anybody what he thought of them. He had 2 hands and a saddle horse, and no idea in the world how to get that cow out, and he had been at it since 7 in the morning, and by 11 he had a rope on her horns, and had pulled her over onto her side, which is the beginning of the end for a bogged cow. And he had stopped, because he was the kind of man who could tell when he was making it worse. He sent his hand to Spring Branch. Delia Bohannon came at 12:30 with the wagon, and Cap in the shafts, and Dove tied on behind. She did not get down and look at the cow first. That is the thing Tobe Artery told people about afterward, every time, for years. She got down and walked the ground. She walked a half circle out from the cow at about 30 feet, stopping and putting her heel down, and then a bigger half circle, and then she came back and unloaded, and what came out of that wagon was 14 planks, 12 feet long and 2 inches thick, worn silver and rounded at the ends from being dragged. 2 coils of manila, a double block and a single block, 2 spades, 1 narrow, a canvas sling with sewn edges and 2 iron rings, a crowbar, an armload of loose hay, and a flat sled of oak plank with a bent iron nose on it, which she called a mud boat, and which weighed as much as a man. She laid the planks. That was the first thing, and it took her 40 minutes, and it looked to 2 men standing there, watching like the most pointless labor they had ever seen. A woman in a blue dress carrying 12-foot planks one at a time out across a wet meadow, and laying them end to end and edge to edge in a path from the good sod to within 6 feet of a stuck cow. Then she walked out on them, and the ground that had been holding a cow to the shoulders held a woman on her planks without a shiver, because that is what a plank does. It takes your weight and spreads it out over 24 square feet, and Tobe Artery said later that watching her walk out over the top of a bog that had beat him all morning was the first time in his life he had ever seen an idea. She got the rope off the cow's horns. She said one thing about that, which was, "This will kill her quicker than the bog will." And she said it without heat, and she never mentioned it again. Then she took the narrow spade and went in beside the cow up to her own thighs in the mud, on her knees on the last plank, and she dug. She dug a channel in alongside the near hind leg, deep, and she worked the spade and let the water run in behind it, and she did the same on the off side, and she was at it the better part of an hour. And when she came up out of it, she was black to the shoulder, and there was mud in her hair, and she did not appear to notice. She ran the sling under the cow's chest, behind the front legs, and set the rings and shackled the single block to them. She set the plank. She dug the trench 40 feet back on the good sod, 4 feet down, and put the oak in on edge, and led the line out of the bottom of it, and filled it and tramped it. She rove the tackle, buried plank, single block on the cow, double block back at the plank, the fall coming back out to the single tree, and Dove standing in her collar, and Hames on the good ground with her head down, half asleep, waiting, And then she pulled a cow out of a Nebraska bog in 9 minutes, and never once raised her voice. She took the slack up, with the mare walking, and when the rope came tight, she said steady one time, and the mare stopped, and leaned, and leaned. The manila came up out of the grass, and stood out straight and hummed, and got thinner, and the cow's shoulders came around an inch, and stopped, and the mare did not stop with her, and did not snatch, and did not quit. She just kept adding, standing there with her hind legs under her, and her neck long, and every muscle in that gray barrel of hers rolling up hard as a road. And the whole time her ears were forward and she was perfectly calm. And somewhere down in that black hole the ground let go of that cow, with a sound the two hands standing there had never heard in their lives, and never forgot. Delia said walk, and the mare walked, and the cow came out over the mud on her side, slow, up the flat of the pull, over the last plank, and onto the sod. They rolled her onto her brisket, and Delia tied her hind legs together at the pastern with a soft rope, because a cow that has been bogged will get up and go straight back in, every time, and no one has ever explained why. She rubbed the mud off her udder and out of her ears. She stuffed hay under her and around her. She sat on her heels beside that cow for 20 minutes rubbing her legs. And then she cut the rope and stood back, and the cow got up and stood there swaying and shook and walked away. Tobe Artery got out $2 silver. $2, Delia said. That's the price. That was 4 hours. It is $2 a head, she said, and it don't matter how long it takes, because if I charged by the hour, I would go slower. And a man ought never to be able to buy a thing that makes me go slower. He put the money in her hand. She got up on the wagon. Mrs. Bohannon, he said. That gray mare. Yes, Tobe Artery stood there and looked at the mud on the planks for a while. Nothing, he said. Come back Thursday. I have got another one in the west meadow, and I would sooner you did it. She pulled 31 head out of the wet meadows of Dunmire County, between the 2nd of April and the 1st of June 1889, and she was paid for 29 of them, and the 2 she was not paid for belonged to a man named Sherd Lusk, who had 4 sections and a piano, and who told her he had not sent for her. Which was true. Ab Doran had sent for her, off his own horse, because he had come across the cows on his way to town, and he could not stand it. Word got around. It got around the way work does in a country where nobody has any money, which is to say slowly and only about the part that touches a man's own pocket. By the middle of that summer there were 11 outfits in Dunmire County who would send for Delia Bohannon before they would try it themselves. And they would tell each other, over a wagon wheel or across the counter at Vors, that the widow on Spring Branch was worth the $2, and that she had a way of laying plank, and that she did not tear a cow's neck up doing it. Not one of them ever said one word about the horse. That is the thing I want to put in front of you plain, because it is the whole shape of these 3 years. It was not that they did not see her. They saw her every time. She was standing right there in the middle of it, 16 hands and 1,340 pounds of her, leaning on a manila rope with her ears forward, while a cow came up out of a hole that 4 men and a saddle horse could not have moved in a week. They saw her do it 31 times in one spring. And then they went home and said the widow on Spring Branch is worth the $2. And the next time the mare came up in talk at the store, they said, that is the mare that quit on Rand Pruitt at Gower's. Both of those things stayed true in the same mouths for 3 years and never once ran into each other. And if you have ever wondered how a whole county can hold a wrong idea while the right one stands in front of it in broad daylight, that is how. The 2 ideas were kept in different rooms, work in one room and character in the other. A horse's work is a thing you hire. A horse's character is a thing you know. They hayed in July. Tobe Artery put up 900 tons that summer on shares, and he hired Delia's team for the stacker, which meant cap and dove on the cable, and it meant Delia in the meadow 6 days a week from the 8th of July, and it meant she was working in a crew of 9 men for the first time since her husband died. They were not cruel to her. It is important to say that. They were careful around her the way men are careful around a widow, and 2 of them cut her hay at home on a Sunday without being asked and would not take anything for it. What they did instead of cruelty was worse, and it cost her more, and it was this. Every single time that Mare put her head down and set her feet, 9 men stopped what they were doing and watched and waited. And one of them would say something, and the thing they said was always a joke, and the joke was always the same joke. There she goes, boys. Rand Pruitt's mare has got an opinion. It came up 4 times that haying. 2 of the 4 were the mare deciding a piece of meadow would not carry a full rack, and both of those times Delia unhooked and went around and lost 20 minutes, and the men laughed. The 3rd time she went around, and Newt Saipe, Curly's uncle, drove his own rack over the same 40 feet to make a point, and put the near wheel into the hub, and it took an hour and a half and both teams to get it out, and after it was out, Newt Saipe stood there scraping his boot and said, "That was the wheel, not the ground," and everybody agreed with him, and Delia Bohannon said nothing. The 4th time was the 26th of August, and it was different because Tobe Artery was on the rack. They were bringing hay off the low ground at the head of the west meadow late in the day, and Dove stopped in the middle of a clean green flat that 11 loads had crossed since noon. Delia stopped the team. Tobe stood up on the load and looked out over it. "How much do you want to bet me?" he said to nobody. "I don't bet, Mr. Artery, no." He climbed down off the load and walked out ahead of the horses about 60 feet and stood there, and then he walked back a little and stood there, and then he came back to the wagon. "There is water moving under that," he said. "You can feel it come up through your boot. Take it around by the corner and we will lose 10 minutes. They took it around by the corner. 2 days later a spring broke open in the middle of that flat and made a hole you could have set a wagon box in. Tobe Artery never said anything about it to anybody. He was not that kind of man, and it would not have done any good. But from that day he stopped watching the mare when she stopped, and started watching the ground, and he was the only man in Dunmire County who ever did. Now the lane. The Bohannon place on Spring Branch sat 11 miles northwest of Satley, and between it and town lay the Cross H, 6 sections of deeded land Hal Pruitt's father had bought in the 70s along the Loop, running north and south, with the river on one side and a wall of choppy sandhills on the other. There was a lane through it. It had been a wagon track before there was a fence, and when the Cross H fenced in 1884, they left it open, with a wire gate at each end, and every man on Spring Branch had used it ever since. It saved 14 miles. 14 miles is nothing to talk about if you are on a saddle horse, and it is the whole difference between a trade and no trade if you are hauling plank and rope and a mud boat behind 2 horses at a walk. Nobody had a right to it. Everybody used it. That is how 9/10 of the arrangements in that country worked, and everybody understood the terms exactly, which is that you had it as long as the man who owned it did not mind. Hal Pruitt came down the lane on the 19th of September, 1889, and met her at the north gate. She had the wagon and the team, and a mud boat behind, coming home from Sherdlusk's, and she got down to open the gate the way she always did, and he was sitting there on a big brown horse on the other side of it, and he had been sitting there some while. He got down and opened it himself and held it, which was courtesy, and he did not let go of it, which was not. Mrs. Bohannon, Mrs. Pruitt, he was 47 by then. Big through the shoulders, black brows going gray, a heavy, honest face with all the give gone out of it. He was not a bad man, and I am not going to write him as one. He gave $100 to the school at Satley in 1890. He carried 3 families through the winter of 1890 and never asked for it back, and never mentioned it. When a man in that county broke a leg, the cross H cut his hay. I have been meaning to say a thing to you for a year, he said, and I have not said it because my mother asked me not to. And I am going to say it now, because I am tired of carrying it. All right. There is not a thing in the world I can do about that mare. He said it slowly, the way a man says a thing he has already said 400 times inside his own head. She is yours. You bought her fair in an open sale that I ordered myself. If I had wanted her destroyed, I would have done it in August of last year and not sold her, and I did not do it. Because my brother would not have wanted it, and because it would have been a coward's way to spend my grief. So I want it understood there is no order on that horse, and there never will be one from me. I never thought there was. But she is going to leave this county, Hal Pruitt said. Not this year. I have got no way to make it happen, and I would not use one if I had it. She is going to leave, because a horse that stops is going to stop one more time in front of somebody who has got no time, and when she does it, whatever she costs that man is going to be laid at your gate, and it is going to keep being laid at your gate until you cannot carry it, and then you will sell her yourself to somebody a long way from here, and you will tell yourself it was your idea. Delia Bohannon stood with her hand on her wheel horse's shoulder. She stopped on that bank because there is a spring comes in under the north bar at Gower's, she said. It was the only time in 3 years she said it to a Pruitt. You cannot see it. I have stood in it, Mr. Pruitt. 9 feet out from the cut it goes to nothing in 4 seconds. He looked at her. I know about the spring, he said. I found it in November of last year. I went down there with Abdorn and a sounding pole, and we found it in about an hour and a half. Then nothing, he said, and his voice did not rise, and that was the terrible part of it. Then my brother is still in the ground at Satley, and that mare still stood on the bank of a river she had crossed twice that same week and would not go. And he still got down off that wagon and took hold of her, and if she had walked, he would have gone over that bar in front like Abdorn's brown gelding did, and gone in with the rest, and had his hands free and been standing on the bank when it dropped. Or he would not have gone in at all, and there is not one living person who can tell me which. So do not stand there and tell me she was right. I know she was right. She was right, and he is in the ground, and I have got to get up every morning of my life and put those 2 things in the same day. I have been doing it for 13 months. I will do it for 30 years. But I am not going to do it while that horse is standing in the road in front of me. He let go of the gate. You can use the lane, he said. I am not the kind of man that closes a road on a widow. Use it as long as you want it. He got on his horse. But do not ever bring her into my yard, Hal Pruitt said, and do not ever ask me to hire her. Delia Bohannon got what mail she got at Satley from Orpha Pruitt, who was 64 then, and kept the post office in the front room of her house behind a counter her husband had built out of a wagon box, and who was the mother of both of those men. Orpha Pruitt never once was rude to her. She said good morning. She handed the mail across. She asked after Zenis's hands, and she meant it, because she had known Zenis Halcombe since 1871, and had gone to him for help twice in her life, and got it both times. But she did not look at Delia while she did any of it. She looked at the counter, or at the letters, or at the window, and she did the whole transaction in about 11 seconds, and Delia would walk back out into the road with her mail in her hand, and stand there for a second in the sun, feeling like something that had been set down outside a door. That went on for 3 years. It went on 100 times or more. And of everything in this story, the lane, and the pegs, and the sale, and what happened on the chalk, the thing Delia Bohannon told her father she could not get used to was 11 seconds at a counter with a woman who had never done one unkind thing to her in her life. And then there was Ivo Mattoon, who was a different article altogether. Mattoon freighted. He had 12 mules and 2 high-wheelers and a contract to haul for Vor's store and for the Cross H, and he was loud and shrewd and generous when it did not cost him, and he had one talent, which was that he could put a name on a thing and make it stick. It was Ivo Mattoon who started calling the grulla Mare the judge, because, he said, she sat and heard the case, and then she ruled, and it took about a month for that to get all over Dunmire County, and men who had never seen her would say, "Oh, that's the Bohannon woman with the judge," and laugh. It was a good joke. That is the trouble with a good joke. It was funny in 1889, and it was funny in 1890, and by 1891 it had stopped being a joke and turned into the actual name the county used for her. And if you had asked any man in Satley why a horse would be called the judge, he would have told you it was because she was a balker, and would have believed it, and would have been wrong by a whole world. On the 11th of February, 1890, Ivo Mattoon put 4 mules and 30,100 pounds of freight into a spring hole on the flat below Dorrans, and had to send a man 11 miles to Spring Branch to ask a widow to come and get them out. There is a thing that happens in the sandhills in a cold February that catches people who have lived there 10 years. A seep runs under a meadow all winter and never freezes, because it comes up out of the sand at a steady 52 degrees, and the top of it takes a crust of frozen mud and blown snow that will carry a man and a horse and a light rig for weeks, and then a wagon with 1.5 tons on it comes across at 11 in the morning of a mild day, and the whole thing folds up like wet paper. His lead pair went into the brisket. The near-wheeler went down on her side in the collar, which is the worst thing that can happen to a horse in harness anywhere, and the wagon settled to the hubs and then to the box, and Mattoon and his hand got the harness cut off the wheeler, and got her rolled up onto her brisket, and got her front feet on a sack of oats. And then they stood there in the cold for 2 hours and could not do one more thing. They tried the ordinary way first. They always do. They put a rope on the wagon tongue and hitched the 2 mules that were still standing on good ground, and ran them at it, and the mules jumped into it the way mules will, and the rope came tight and stopped them dead and threw them both back on their haunches. And the second time the rope parted, and the end of it went past Mattoon's head close enough that he heard it. Delia Bohannon came at 3:30 with Cap and Dove in the wagon. She was there for 6 hours, and she did it in the dark for the last 2 of them, by the light of 2 lanterns hung on the plank ends. She got the mules out first, one at a time, sling under the chest. Tackle to a buried plank, the mare leaning, the ground letting go with that long sigh. She got the wheeler up and walked her, because a horse that has been down in cold water has to walk or she will stiffen and go down again. Then she went after the wagon, and the wagon took 4 hours, because a loaded wagon in a spring hole is not one problem, it is about 9 of them. You have to break it out of the suction, and you have to keep it from tipping, and you have to lift the tongue, and you cannot do any of it in a straight line. She unloaded it where it stood, in the hole, sack by sack out along her planks. Then she set 2 buried planks at an angle to each other, and ran the tackle twice. At 9:30 that night, with the temperature at 11 degrees and the Manila stiff as a bar, that gray mare walked 18 feet, and a loaded-out freight wagon came up out of a Nebraska seep and rolled onto sod. Ivo Mattoon counted out $5 into her hand, which was her price for a wagon, and then a 1/6, which she gave back. "Take it. It is $5, mister. Mattoon, you've been at it since 3. It is $5 for a wagon, and it does not matter how long it takes." She was so cold she had to say it twice. He stood there in the lantern light, with his hat pushed back, and looked at the mare, and the mare was standing hip-shot with her head down, and steam coming up off her back in the light, half asleep, waiting to be told the next thing. "Well," Ivo Mattoon said, "the judge earned her hay." And he laughed, and his hand laughed, and Delia Bohannon put $5 in her apron pocket and drove home 11 miles in the dark, and that was the whole of it. He told the story at Voorhees for a month, and he told it well, and he told it accurately, and every single time he told it he called that mare the judge, and every single time the men listening laughed in the right place. And not one of them ever put together in his head that the horse in the funny name and the horse in the story were the same animal, doing the same thing with the same disposition. That was Delia Bohannon's good year. She pulled 74 head out of the meadows between the 20th of March and the 4th of June 1890 at $2 a head, and 11 wagons and 1 haystacker at $5 apiece. And in July and August, she and her team were on Tobe Artery's cable for 46 days, and on the 30th of September 1890, she walked into Voor's store and paid Emmett Voor the last $37. 60 of a $220 debt that had been standing since her husband died, and Emmett Voor wrote paid across the page and turned the book around so she could see it. 3 years and 7 months, he said. Mrs. Bohannon, there's men in this county been carrying less than that since 1884. I know it. You want a paper on it? I want you to leave the book open on the counter for about an hour, Delia said. If it is not too much trouble, and Emmett Voor, who was not a slow man, left it open until closing time. That was as close as she ever came to saying anything. Tobe Artery came out to Spring Branch 6 times in 1890, and never once for a reason that could not have been handled by sending word. He brought a pitman for the mowing machine in April and put it in himself. He brought a wagon wheel in June that he said he had no use for, which was a lie, because it was new. In August, he came at 8 in the evening with a sack of new potatoes and sat on the bench outside the harness room with Zenas Halcomb for 2 hours, and the two of them talked about the Nebraska City Road and about a freighter named Duckworth, who had been dead since 1869. And Delia washed harness 15 feet away and did not join in, and did not go inside either. When he was leaving, he stopped by the corral and looked at the mare a while. How many is it now? 11, Delia said. Out of how many hitches? I have not counted the hitches. You have, Tobe Artery said. She looked at the ground. Something over 2,000, she said. He nodded slowly and got on his horse and said good night to her father and rode off. And that is the entire romance of this story, for the first 2.5 years of it. And if you are waiting for more than that, you are going to wait a good while, because that is how it was between those two people, and I am not going to improve on it. The 11th peg was Sherrod Lusk's in June of 1890, and it is the one I want you to hold in your mind when we get to July of the following year. Lusk had 4 sections east of the chalk and a new haystacker coming from Tolman, and he had hired Delia and her team to haul it out because his own outfit was in the hay and because it was 900 pounds of iron on a borrowed running gear. They came off the Tolman Road at the northeast corner and started down the long swale toward his place, and half a mile down, in a wide grassy bottom that 100 loads had crossed, Dove stopped. Sherrod Lusk was riding alongside. He was a heavy, pink, prosperous man who had come from Ohio with money and had never in 11 years asked anybody in Dunmire County for advice about anything. Go on, he said. She won't. Mrs. Lusk, then take her out and put the other one in front. I am not going to do that. She got down and started to unhook. Mrs. Bohannon, that is 40 rods of dry bottom. My own hay racks have been over it 8 times this week. Then it will go around in 10 minutes and no harm anywhere. Sherrod Lusk was not a patient man, and he had paid $185 for that stacker. He sent his hand back to the house for a team and a wagon, and when it came he had the stacker skidded off her running gear onto his own, and he drove his own team straight down that swale, and 200 feet on, the off-hind wheel dropped through into a soft lens that had 1.5 feet of gray soup under a hand's thickness of root sod. They were 4 hours getting it out. The stacker came off and went over on its side and bent the mast, and the whole thing had to go to Tolman to a blacksmith, and it cost him $28 and a week of his haying. Delia Bohannon did not charge him for the haul, and did not say one word about it then or ever. Sherd Lusk told that story too. He told it the same as Ivo Mattoon told his. He said, "I broke a wheel through in the West Swale, dirtiest piece of ground in this county, you cannot tell by looking." And that was true, and it is what he believed. And when a man at the store said, "Wasn't that the day the Bohannon woman's Mare quit on you?" Sherd Lusk said, "That is right. And I lost an hour on that too." Both halves. Same mouth. Different rooms. Her father got worse that year in the way old men get worse, which is not all at once. In the spring he could get to the corral. By November he was going to the harness room bench and back, and that was the day's travel. And Delia had built him a rail to hold on to. And on the bad morning she brought his coffee out to him, and they sat and looked at the hills. He talked about weight. It was his one subject at the end, the way an old preacher gets down to one text. Every man that ever got killed in this trade, he said, got killed because he asked the wrong question. He asks, will it hold? That ain't a question. Hold what? A boot? A horse? A load? There is ground in this country that will carry a man and turn to water under a cow. And there is ground that will carry a cow and let a herd through, and it is the same ground and it looks the same all four ways from the middle. He turned his coffee cup around with both of his wrecked hands, because he could not hook a finger in the handle. Ground don't answer a shovel, Delia, it answers weight. And it don't answer the weight you put on it. It answers the weight you put on it all at once. You have said that to me 40 times. I will say it 40 more, Zenas Halcombe said. You will need it on a day when I ain't here to say it. There were 13 pegs on the wall in the harness room at the end of 1890. Now I have to tell you about the chalk, because everything from here on happens on it or because of it. Between the hills and the Tolman Road, 7 miles south and a little east of Satley, there is a place where the sandhills quit all at once, and the country lies down flat. It is an old lake bed. In the wet years there is water standing in the middle of it a foot deep and 800 acres across, thick and gray and bitter, and no stock will drink it, and nothing grows in it. And in the dry months it goes down to a hard white pan that rings under a horse's foot like a plank floor. That is what it is named for. It is 2¼ miles across from the north edge to the south edge, dazzling white in July, and flat as a table the whole way over. And it was the road. Not a road anybody built, the road everybody took. Going from the north end of Dunmire County to the shipping pens at Tolman, you could go around the chalk by the east, which was 31 miles and 3 sandhills that would take the heart out of a loaded team, or you could go straight across the chalk and be at the pens in 19. Everybody crossed it. Freighters crossed it. Trail herds crossed it. Ivo Mattoon crossed it 40 times a year with 12 mules and 2 loaded high-wheelers, and never so much as slowed down in the middle, and in 11 years there was not one recorded instance of anybody or anything going through the crust of that flat. That is not a small point, and I want to be fair about it. When men in Dunmire County said the chalk was as good as a bridge, they were not being careless or stupid or greedy. They were saying the thing that 11 years of everybody's own experience had told them, and they were right about every crossing that had ever been made across it up to that day. What none of them knew, because there was no way to know it, and no instrument in that county that could have found it, and no reason on this earth for anybody to go looking, was what the chalk actually is. It is a plate. It is a rind of hard alkali salts and baked clay, somewhere between an inch and 4 inches thick, and it is laid over the top of a bed of blue-gray clay silt 50 feet deep that is full of water all the way to the bottom and has the working consistency of soft soap. The plate carries everything, all summer, every summer, as long as the load is spread out: a man, a horse, a wagon, 10 wagons, 100 heads strung out in a line walking straight across. A plate does not break where you stand on it. A plate breaks where you bend it. On the 16th of July, 1891, 11 men and 4 rigs went down to Tolman together for the summer's freight, because that is how it was done in that country, when the road was long and the loads were heavy, and everybody had money on the same list. Evo Mattoon had his 2 high-wheelers and 12 mules. Tobe Artery had a wagon and his crew. Sherd Lusk sent a wagon and a hand. And Delia Bohannon had Cap and Dove and her own rig, hired by Artery at $4 for the round trip to bring back the knives and the guards and 600 feet of cable and a crate of stacker teeth. They went down empty across the chalk on the morning of the 16th, in a line, with the white burning under them and the heat coming up off it in sheets so you could see the far edge of the world swimming. They loaded at the pens and the depot at Tolman and stayed the night. They came back loaded on the 17th, at 11 o'clock in the morning, in the worst of the glare, and they came onto the chalk from the south side, in a line, Mattoon leading, then Lusk's wagon, then Artery, then Delia last with the light load. 740 paces out onto the flat, Dove stopped. It was the middle of the widest, flattest, hardest, most nothing piece of ground in the state of Nebraska. There was no grass on it. There was no color on it. There was not a rise on it the height of a hat brim in 2¼ miles. It rang under a hoof. You could see the wheel tracks of 100 crossings running away in front of her, straight as a ruled line. And the last of them had been laid down by 12 mules and 6,000 pounds of freight about 90 seconds before. The mare put her head down and set her feet and stood. Delia said, "Walk on." The mare did not walk on. She said it again and slapped the lines lightly on her, and the mare leaned back into the breeching an inch and stood. The wagons ahead went on for 100 yards before anybody noticed, and then they stopped, and then men started walking back. She did everything right, and I want that on the record. She got down. She walked out ahead of the horses 40 feet and back, putting her heel down hard every third step. Listening, she walked a circle out around the near side and back across. She got down on one knee and put the flat of her hand on the crust and then the side of her face on the back of her hand. She had the crowbar off the wagon and she drove it down, and it went 3 inches and stopped like it had hit a floor. By then there were 11 men standing around her in a ring on the white, with their hats down over their eyes. "Well?" Evo Mattoon said, not unkindly. "Give me a minute. You have got the sun on 11 men and 2 ton of hay knives, Mrs. Bohannon, I know it. Give me a minute." He gave her about 4. Then he walked back to his lead team, and he turned his whole outfit, 12 mules and 2 loaded high-wheelers, better than 6,000 pounds, and he brought them around in a slow circle and drove them straight over the spot where that mare's front feet were standing. Twice, over and back. The white rang under the tires like a bridge. Then Lusk's hand drove his wagon over it. Then Nutsipe rode his saddle horse out into the middle of it and made him spin twice on his hocks, which is about the most weight a man can put on the smallest piece of ground he can put it on, and the crust did not so much as dust up. Nobody laughed. That is the part I have to make you understand about the 17th of July, and it is the reason it broke her. If they had laughed, she could have carried it. There was one bark of a laugh out of one of Artery's hands, and it died on its own in about a second and a half. And after that 11 men stood in a 2-mile circle of white salt in 100 degrees, and looked at a woman with genuine, honest, uncomfortable pity, which is the one thing on this earth that Delia Bohannon had no defense against at all. She got the narrow spade off the wagon, and she dug a hole. It took her 25 minutes in the hardest ground she had ever put a tool into. She went down through 3 inches of white plate, and it came up in slabs like broken crockery. And under it, there was gray clay, damp and cool and heavy, and she dug it out to 2 feet, and it stood in a clean square wall with the spade marks in it. And she drove the crowbar down into the floor of that hole with both hands, and got 9 inches and no more. She stood in the hole to her waist, in a blue dress with white salt dust in every fold of it, and 11 men looked down at her. "Mrs. Bohannon," Tobe Artery said, "is there something in there, or ain't there?" And she could have said, "I do not know." It was the exact truth. She did not know. She was 33 years old, and she had a father at home who had taught her never in her life to tell a lie to a rope. And she had never worked out that a rope is not the only thing you can lie to, and that there are days when "I do not know" is not a coward's answer, but the only honest one there is. Delia Bohannon put both hands on the edge of the hole and looked at the 2-foot wall of clay she had cut, and she said it in a clear voice so that every man there heard it. "No," she said, "there is nothing here." Then she climbed out and unhooked the mare. She took Dove out of the lead, and she put Cap in front alone, and she led that gray mare 200 yards around in an arc to the east and brought her back onto the line, and the mare walked around it without a hitch in her step and stood to be hooked in again on the far side, and then she pulled a light load 2 miles across the chalk in the heat without one thing wrong with her from that minute to the north edge. Before she got up on the wagon, she did the other thing, and it is the thing they told about her at the store for the next 2 months. She cut a willow stake 3 feet long out of the brush bundle in the wagon box, and she went back to the hole, and she tore a strip off the hem of her under petticoat, which was blue, and tied it to the top of that stake. And she drove the stake into the crust at the edge of the hole with the back of the spade until it stood up on its own. Then she paced the distance to the north edge and counted it out loud twice, and looked at the notch in the hills where the 2 cedar posts of Lusk's Corner stood up on the skyline, and lined it, and stood there a second, and got up on the wagon. "What's that for?" one of Artery's men said. "So I can find it." Ivo Mattoon laughed then. He could not help it, and I do not entirely blame him. "Find it," he said. "Mrs. Bohannon, that is the exact middle of nothing. There ain't a thing in this county easier to find." They came off the chalk at the north edge at 12:30 and got home that night. And inside of 9 days, Delia Bohannon did not have a trade any more. That is faster than you would think, and it did not take any malice at all. It only took the story, and it was a good story, and it traveled like a good story travels. The Bohannon woman's mare stopped on the chalk, and 11 men waited on her, and Ivo Mattoon drove 6,000 pounds over the spot twice. And she dug a hole in it 2 foot deep, and then she stood up in that hole and said herself, out loud, in front of everybody, "There is nothing here." That last part was the whole of it. As long as she had never said anything, a man could tell himself she knew something he did not. There was even a kind of comfort in it. Now she had gone and taken the one thing away, honestly and on purpose. And once she had said it, there was not a man in Dunmire County who could hire that horse and look easy about it. Because it was no longer an argument, it was a settled fact with her own name on it. Tobe Artery rode out to Spring Branch on the 26th of July. He came at 9 in the morning, which was a working hour, and he stayed on his horse, and Delia knew what it was before he opened his mouth. "I have got 900 tons to put up," he said, and 11 days of weather to do it in, and I have got 7 men that want to be paid, whether it goes up or don't. Yes, I lost 3 days of my season to that mare in 2 years, and I never said a word about it to you, because I did not mind, and I still do not mind. But I have got Newt Sip and Ab's boy telling my other men they will not work behind her. And I have got the Cross H hay on shares, and Hal Pruitt has got a right to expect me to put it up and not to sit in a meadow waiting on a horse. You want the team without her. I want the team without her. Delia Bohannon stood in her own yard with her hands folded in front of her apron. No, she said. Tobe Artery sat there and looked at his saddle horn for a long moment. I thought you would say that, he said. I want you to know I would rather you did. And I want you to know it is going to cost you about $180 between now and the 1st of September, and I have got no way on this earth to make that right. I know what it costs. Delia, it was the first time he had ever used her name, and he did it badly. Would you tell me one thing straight? That day on the chalk. Was there something there? And she stood in her yard, and she was still honest, and she was still 33 years old, and she said the second worst sentence of her life, which was, I dug it. Tobe, there was nothing in it. He nodded and turned his horse and rode off, and that is how a woman loses the last man in a county who is on her side, not by lying to him, but by telling him the truth about the only question he knows how to ask. Hal Pruitt came 4 days after that. He came up the lane and stopped at her north gate and did not get down, and Delia walked out to him through the corral, and she knew what that was too, because there is a way a man sits a horse when he has come to take something and does not like himself. I am closing the lane, he said. All right. I want to say why, and I would be obliged if you would let me say the whole thing before you answer, because I have been 3 days getting it in order. Say it. On the 17th of this month, in the middle of the chalk, in front of 11 men, my brother's name got said out loud again. He was looking at the hills behind her the whole time. Ivo Mattoon said it. He said, Rand Pruitt's mare has got an opinion, boys, and everybody laughed, and it went from there to Tolman and back, and it come into my mother's post office on the 20th in the mouth of a man buying a stamp, and she did not know he was there, and he did not know she was, and she sat down on the floor behind that counter. Mrs. Bohannon, she is 66 years old. I found her sitting on the floor. Delia Bohannon did not say anything. Now I know that is not your doing, Hal Pruitt said. I know it as well as I know my own name. You did not name that horse the judge, and you did not tell that joke, and you have never in 3 years said one word to me about my brother except one true thing at a gate. And it does not matter, and I want you to hear me be honest about that, because I could dress this up, and I am not going to. It does not matter what is fair. That mare is in this county, and every time she stops, my brother gets brought up out of the ground and passed around a store. So she is going to have to be somewhere else, and I have got exactly one thing in the world I can do about it, and I am going to do it, and it is a low thing. The lane. The lane. I am closing it on the 1st of August. That puts you 14 miles the wrong side of everything you do. I know what that means. It means you cannot haul plank and rope to a bogged cow at $2 a head and come home the same day, and it means the trade you built is not a trade anymore, and it means that sometime this fall or this winter you are going to sit down at a table and add it up and sell that horse. And you can live with that. No, Hal Pruitt said, but I can live with it better than I can live with my mother on the floor. He turned his horse. I will keep the lane open for anybody else on Spring Branch, he said. It is not their doing either. And Mrs. Bohannon, if you ever want to sell her to me, I will pay you $300 for that mare, and I will not lay a hand on her, and I will send her to a man I know in Wyoming who will work her the rest of her life and never hear a word about any of this. That offer will stand as long as I am above ground." Delia Bohannon stood at the gate with her hand on the post. "She has stopped 17 times in 3 years," she said. It was the first number she had ever said out loud to anybody but her father. 12 of them I went back and found the reason, and I could take you to every one. 4 of them I never found anything. One of them was on the chalk on the 17th, and I dug it myself, and there was nothing in it. I have hitched her something over 3,000 times. Hal Pruitt sat and thought about that for a while, and he was an honest man, and it went into him, and it did not move him 1 inch, and that is the truest and hardest thing in this whole story. "Then she is right about everything, except the times she ain't," he said. "That is the trouble with her, ma'am. That is exactly the trouble with her." The lane closed on the 1st of August, 1891, and Hal Pruitt wired the gates himself so that no hand of his would have to do it. And by the middle of September, Delia Bohannon had worked 6 days in 7 weeks. 14 miles does not sound like much when you say it. Say it in a wagon at a walk with a mudboat dragging, and it is 4 hours out and 4 hours home. And it means you leave at 3 in the morning, and you are back at 10 at night, and the cow you were sent for has been standing in a bog since the day before, and after the 2nd time a man sends for you, and you get there too late, he does not send the 3rd time, and he is not wrong to stop. She had 2 jobs in August. She had one in the first 2 weeks of September, and that one was Ab Doran, who paid her $3 for a $2 job and would not hear about it. She sold the young horses on the 22nd of August. There were 4 of them, coming 3 and coming 4, 2 of them out of Peach, and 2 she had bought as weanlings in the year Reese died, and they were the whole of what a place like that has, instead of a bank. You raise them for 4 years, and you sell them broke at 5, and that is your increase, and it is the only money in the Sandhills that comes in a lump. A buyer named Spear out of Grand Island took all 4 unbroke on the 22nd for $260, which was about $180 less than they were worth broke, and she stood in the gate and watched him lead them off in a string, and then she went in the harness room and stayed there until it got dark. Evo Mattoon came on the 4th of September and made her an honest offer, and I have to give it to him plain because it was not cruel and it was not a trick. "I will give you $40 for the whole set of harness, and I will give you $25 for the 2 blocks, and I will hire you for the pulling," he said. "You would be working for me, and it would be my rig and my name on it, and I would send you where the work is, and I would pay you $1 a head and keep $1. And you would clear more than you have cleared in this house in 2 years, and you would not have to cross my brains about it. I know what you are worth, ma'am. I have watched you do it." "And the mare, sell her to Pruitt," Evo Mattoon said. "He will give you $300, and he will not hurt her." "Mrs. Bohannon, I have been calling that horse the Judge for 2 years, and I have made a good deal of noise about it, and I am not going to stand in your yard and pretend I did not. But I have hauled freight in this country for 11 years, and I will tell you a true thing. There ain't a horse alive worth what she is costing you." He was right. That was an entirely correct statement of the arithmetic, and every person in Dunmire County would have agreed with it, including her father, and Delia Bohannon told him no, and thanked him, and gave him a cup of coffee before he left, and after he was gone she sat down at the table and did the arithmetic herself on the back of a feed bill, and it came out exactly the way he said it came out. She went out at 4 o'clock the next morning and haltered the mare and started for the Cross H. It was the 5th of September, and there was no moon left, and she walked, leading her, going the long way around because the lane was shut, and she had it all settled in her mind, and I want to say that she had it settled honestly and not in a fit. She was going to take the $300. She was going to keep the harness and the blocks and the planks and the mud boat, and put Cap in the near side, and go back to work in a country where nobody had any particular opinion about a bay gelding, and the mare was going to go to a man in Wyoming and be worked and fed and never spoken about, which is more than most horses get. 3.5 miles down the road, at the top of the grade above Kelso Draw, the mare stopped. Delia stood in the dark on the end of the lead rope and said, out loud, to nobody at all, not tonight. The mare stood. So she got the lantern out of the sack she was carrying, and lit it, and walked ahead, and 40 feet on she found where the road came down off the grade, and crossed the head of the draw on a fill. And under that fill there had been a culvert of cedar poles laid in 1883 and covered over. And the poles had gone to punk, and the crown of the fill had settled into a hollow that you could not see in. The dark, and that you would not have looked at twice in the daylight, and when she put her boot heel into the middle of it, it went into the ankle and came out with a sound like a foot coming out of a pail. She stood there on that road at 4:30 in the morning, with a lantern in her hand, and the whole gray mare standing behind her in the dark, quiet, waiting to be told what to do next. And Delia Bohannon sat down in the road and put the lantern beside her and put her face in her apron and cried for about 4 minutes, which was the second time she had done it since her husband died. And then she got up and blew the light out and turned around and led that horse home 11 miles in the dark and got there at 9 in the morning and put her in the corral and gave her hay. She told her father where she had been. She told him the whole of it, standing in front of him with her hat still on. Zenas Halcombe was very bad by then. His voice had gone down to about half of what it had been, and he could not sit up straight for long, and he had to think before every sentence the way a man thinks before he lifts something heavy. "Well," he said, "so what are you now? I am a woman with 1 horse and no work and no increase and $214 in the house. That ain't what I asked." She stood there. "I am going to keep her," Delia said, "and go broke." "That is the first sensible thing you have said in a year." He got a breath. "Delia, that day out on the salt." "Don't. I am going to say it. You dug a hole in it. I dug it 2 foot down, Pa, and I drove the bar 9 inches into the floor of it, and there was nothing in it, and I said so, and I would say so again." "You put a spade in it," Zenas Halcombe said. "A spade weighs 9 pounds. She did not answer him. She went out and washed harness that did not need washing. But she carried that around with her for the next 12 days the way you carry a stone in a boot, and it was still in there on the morning of the 18th, and I want you to have it in your pocket too." Now here is what was happening on the other side of the county, while Delia Bohannon was selling colts and washing harness that nobody had hired. The Cross H had 318 head of 4-year-old steers to ship, and it was the biggest single shipment Hal Pruitt had ever made, and the whole year was standing on it. He had a buyer out of Omaha named Renfrew, who had contracted them in June at 3.25 cents, and the market had been sliding all summer, and the contract said delivered on the cars at Tolman. And the Burlington had 11 cars spotted at Tolman for the 21st of September, and there is no arguing with a railroad about a date. If those cattle were not standing in the pens at Tolman on the 21st, the cars went to somebody else, and the next cars were the 6th of October, and Renfrew's contract died on the 30th, and the price on the 6th of October was going to be whatever the price on the 6th of October was. The gather went wrong. It usually does. They worked the North Hills from the 8th, and they were 4 days finding a bunch of about 90 head that had drifted into the breaks above Doran's, and by the evening of the 16th of September the Cross H had 318 steers thrown together on the flats north of the chalk, and exactly 4 days to have them on the cars, and the road around the east side of the chalk was 31 miles of choppy sandhills. that no man walks a beef herd over in less than 2.5 days without shrinking every animal in it, and the road across the chalk was 19 miles of table flat ground, with water at the far side, and a herd could be at the pens by dark of the second day. The Cross H had trailed around the east side every fall for 11 years. Not because anybody was afraid of the chalk. Because there is no feed on the chalk and no water on it, and a beef herd does not like the glare, and going around gave you 2 nights on grass. That is all. It was a feed decision, and this year the feed decision cost more than the 4 days did. Delia Bohannon heard about it on the 15th of September at Vor's store, where she had gone with her butter, and she heard it from Ivo Mattoon, who was telling Emmett Vor about it because he was hauling the wagon and the bed rolls down and had been told to be on the south edge by noon of the 19th. And she rode 14 miles the wrong way around on the 16th of September, on cap, in the rain, to the Cross H headquarters to say one thing to a man who had told her never to bring the mare into his yard, and she did not bring the mare into his yard. She left her at home. She rode a bay gelding 28 miles round to say a sentence. She did not get Hal Pruitt. He was north with the gather. She got his foreman, a level, decent, unhurried man named Ord Tisdale, and she got Sherd Lusk, who was there about pasture, and she got Ivo Mattoon, who had just come in with the wagon, and the 3 of them stood under the shed roof out of the rain and heard her out, and she did it as well as it could have been done. Do not put them across in a bunch, Delia Bohannon said. String them, take them over 4 wide and let them walk, and keep the drags a 1/4 mile back off the leaders. And do not hold them anywhere in the middle of it, and above everything else in this world, do not mill them out there. Why? Ord Tisdale said. It was not a challenge. He genuinely asked. Because that crust is a plate over blue mud 50 foot deep, and a plate does not break where you stand on it. It breaks where you bend it. Mrs. Bohannon, Ivo Mattoon said, I have run 6,000 pound over the middle of that flat, twice in 1 minute in July, with you standing there watching me do it. Strung out, she said, in a line. 12 mules and 2 wagons is 110 foot long, and it is under a ton to the running foot. 318 head thrown into a bunch on 100 foot of ground is 900,000 pounds standing on about 1/4 of an acre, and every one of them turning on his hind feet at the same time. There was a silence under that shed roof, and it lasted long enough that for the rest of her life she believed she had done it. Then Sherd Lusk said, Ma'am, was that not the same ground you dug up with your own spade and told 11 men there was nothing in it? Yes, well, Sherd Lusk said, and that was all he said, and it was enough. Ord Tisdale walked her out to her horse and held it while she got up, which was the courtesy of that country, and he stood with his hand on the rein a second. I will string them, he said. That much I will do, and I would have done it anyway. But Mrs. Bohannon, we have got 11 cars on the 21st and a buyer that is looking for a way out of a June price, and if them steers ain't in Tolman we do not ship this year, and I have got 318 head of somebody else's money to walk 19 mile. I cannot be careful about a thing I have got no reason to believe in. I know it. Do you know it? He said, because I would sooner you did. There ain't a man out there that wishes you any harm. There is just not one of us that can afford you. She rode home 14 miles in the rain and got in at midnight. On the evening of the 17th of September, 1891, Delia Bohannon rode down to the north edge of the chalk by herself on cap and sat there an hour. The herd was bedded 3 miles north on the flats. She could see the dust of it hanging and hear them when the air came right, and she could see the wagon in one small fire. And out on the white, 740 paces from the edge, on the line of the 2 cedar posts at Lusk's corner, her willow stake was still standing where she had driven it on the 17th of July. The rag on it had gone from blue to almost white in 9 weeks of that sun. It stood up out of 2¼ miles of nothing like the last tooth in a jaw, and there was no earthly reason for it to be there, and everybody who had ridden past it that summer had wondered about it, and nobody had pulled it up. She looked at it until the light went. Then she rode home and got there at 11 and did not go to bed. She sat in the harness room with a lantern, and she oiled 60 feet of 3/4-inch manila, and she spliced a new eye in the end of the second coil, and she checked every strap on the pulling harness and put a new tug buckle on the off side, and she loaded the wagon in the dark, 14 planks, 2 coils, the double block and the single, both spades, the crowbar, the canvas sling, the mud boat, 4 sacks of loose hay, 2 lanterns, a can of oil, and a jug of water. She did not know what she was loading for. She has said that herself, later, to 2 different people, and I believe her. She was a woman who had been told her whole life that ground answers weight, and there were 318 head of cattle bedded 3 miles from a piece of ground she had stood in a hole in and called nothing. And she loaded a wagon at midnight because she could not sit still, and then she sat on the wagon seat in her own yard in the dark until it started to get light. They put 318 head onto the chalk at 20 minutes past 6 on the morning of the 18th of September, 1891. And Ord Tisdale strung them exactly the way he had said he would, 4 and 5 wide, walking, with the drags held back a good 1/4 mile, and for 1 hour and 40 minutes it was the prettiest crossing anybody there had ever been part of. 9 riders. 1.5 miles of cattle laid out across white ground, in a line you could have sighted a rifle down. The glare came up as the sun got height, and the leaders slowed the way beef always slows in glare. And the middle closed on them a little, and the drags closed on the middle, and by 8 o'clock that herd was not 1.5 miles long anymore. It was about 400 yards long. And nobody in the world would have thought a thing about it, because they were still walking, and because there is no such thing as a bad piece of ground on the chalk. They did not run. I want that said clearly, because it got told wrong for years afterward, and it matters. Those cattle never ran 1 step in the whole of it. There was no storm, there was no shot, there was nothing on that flat to spook a chicken. At about 10 minutes past 8, 740 paces out from the north edge, on the line of the 2 cedar posts at Lusk's Corner, near a willow stake with a sun-bleached rag on it, 4 steers in the middle of the bunch went through the crust to the brisket. The ones behind them saw it and stopped. The ones behind those came up onto them and turned, and the leaders felt the pressure go off and slowed, and the whole 400 yards of that herd folded in on itself and turned into a bunch about 150 feet across, and stood there, milling 318 head of 4-year-old steers weighing 1,100 pounds apiece, turning on their hind feet in one place. That is 900,000 pounds on 1/4 of an acre, and every hoof in it working. The plate did not shatter. It bent. It dished down in the middle, like the bottom of a hat, slow, over about 2 minutes, and the blue mud came up through the cracks gray and cold and smelling of soda, and then the middle of that dish went out of it altogether, and 141 head of cattle went down into a 50-foot bed of soft blue silt that had been lying there since before there were people in Nebraska. Curly Sipe met Delia Bohannon on the Satley Road at 8 minutes past 9, going the other way, on a horse that was done. He was 20 years old. He had been at Gower's Crossing in 1888 when he was 17, and he had held a lantern that night, and he had watched a woman pull a cow out of Tobe Artery's West Meadow in the spring of 1889, and had asked her 4 questions and got 4 answers. And he was the only living person who had ever done that. Ord Tisdale had sent him for Evo Mattoon and Mattoon's mules and every rope in Satley. He had got 2 miles down the road and turned off and come this way instead, and he was going to hear about that for a while, and then he was going to stop hearing about it forever. "How many men in it?" she said. "2. And Mr. Pruitt. Where is Mr. Pruitt? He went in on his horse after the first bunch," Curly Sipes said. "He was crying, and he did not know it. He got the horse turned and out. He did not get himself out. He is 60 yards from the good, and he has been in it since 8:30, and every time a man gets within 20 foot of him, the crust lets go, and he goes deeper." Delia Bohannon turned that wagon around in the road and put both horses into a trot with a ton of plank and rope behind them, and did not say one word for 4 miles. She came onto the north edge of the chalk at 10:30. There were 9 riders and about 40 men by then, because word had gone up and down that country the way it does. And there was a wall of noise coming off that flat that she never afterward could describe to anybody. There were 141 head of cattle in the mud spread over 3 or 4 acres. There was a rope on a steer and 4 saddle horses in a line on the other end of it, and as she came up, they hit it, all 4 together, the way men do. And the rope stood out straight and parted at the splice, and the 4 horses went down on their haunches in a heap. There were 2 cross-H hands out in it up to their chests, 40 feet apart, roped under the arms and being watched by men who could not get to them. And 60 yards out from the firm rim, in the middle of a gray dish of broken plate and standing mud, there was a black hat, and under the black hat the head and both shoulders of Hal Pruitt, and nothing else of him at all. He had been in it 2 hours and 10 minutes. She did not go out. That is the first thing she did, and it is the thing that saved him, and it is also the thing that made about 11 men that day want to take her by the arms. She drove the wagon along the north rim at a walk for 200 yards, one way and then back, looking at the ground, and men rode alongside shouting at her, and she looked at the ground. Because here is what she was reading, and there was not another person in the state of Nebraska that morning who could have read it. The plate had not broken everywhere. It had broken where it had been bent, and it had bent under the mill, and the failure had run outward from the middle in a rough oval, and the cracks in the white showed her the shape of it, exactly the way a cracked window shows you where the stone hit. Everything inside the oval was gone. Everything outside it was as sound as it had been the day before, except along the north, where the men and horses of the last 2 hours had beaten a churned crescent into the rim itself, and were still standing on it. 200 yards to the east, the oval came within 80 feet of ground that had never had a thing on it. She brought the wagon around to that place and pulled up and started to back the team to bring the tailgate square, and Dove stopped. Somebody in that crowd of men laughed. It came out of him before he could get his hand up. Delia Bohannon got down off that wagon without a word and walked 11 paces out ahead of her mare and put her heel into the crust, and it went through, and she stepped back and looked and saw that the whole rim there had been undercut where the water in the dish had run back under it. And it was a shelf of white plate a hand thick, standing over nothing, with a rat's nest of cracks through it, and it would have taken the wagon and both horses in about 4 seconds. 12 feet north, she said, and hold there. Then she went to work, and she was 33 years old, and there were 40 men standing behind her, and she never raised her voice one time in the next 3 hours. She dug the trench. 4 feet deep, crossways to the pull, in good sod 30 feet back from the rim, and 2 men dug it with her because she told them exactly where to put a spade, and they did it. She set a 6-foot oak plank in it on its edge and led the rope out of the bottom through a channel, and they filled it, and 8 men tramped it down. She shackled the double block to the plank line, and the fall came back out to the single tree, and she put Dove in the collar and Hames alone, facing away from the flat, and turned her and set her and left her standing. Then she laid plank. 14 planks, 12 feet long, 2 inches thick, silver gray and rounded at the ends. She carried them out one at a time on her shoulder and laid them end to end and edge to edge on the sound white, walking out on what she had already laid. And when she got to the end of the 14th, she picked up the first one behind her and carried it forward and laid it down in front. And then the second, and the third, and that is how a plank road walks. It is the slowest thing you will ever watch. Every 12 feet of progress costs you the whole length of the road twice. She was 1 hour and 5 minutes getting 80 feet, and by the end of it she was laying plank over standing mud, and the planks were floating and lifting under her boots as she stepped, and 40 men on the bank had stopped shouting altogether, and were watching her the way you watch a thing in a church. She got to Hal Pruitt at 11:45. He was gray in the face, and his lips had gone the color of the mud, and he had stopped shivering, which is the bad sign, and she knew it. His arms were free from the elbow up. He had a rope under his arms that 4 men had put 100 pounds of nothing on for 2 hours. "Mrs. Bohannon," he said, "don't talk yet." She got the last plank across in front of him and lay down flat on her belly on it and worked the narrow spade in beside his right hip, down along his leg, all the way to the boot, and moved it, and let the water run in behind it. Then the left. She was at it 40 minutes. She could not see one thing she was doing. She did it with the spade and her hands and by feel, and she talked the whole time in a low, ordinary voice about nothing. About the weather, about a mare named Peach, because a man who has been in cold mud for 3 hours has to be kept where you can find him. She cut his coat off him with a jackknife because the coat was full and holding him like a sea anchor. She got the canvas sling down under his arms and around his chest and set both rings and shackled the single block into them. And then she stood up on that plank and looked back 60 yards at a gray mare, standing in a collar at the far end of a rope, and she said one word. "Dove." She said it in a conversational voice. It carried across that flat in the silence like a bell. The mare took up the slack, walking. The manila came up out of the white dust and stood straight and began to hum. Steady, the mare stopped and leaned, and the whole of what happened next took 40 minutes and consisted, from the bank, of absolutely nothing at all. Here is what a man does not understand until he has seen it. Ground does not give a man back fast. The suction on a body buried to the armpits in blue silt is measured in tons, and it does not let go to force. It lets go to time. You take up the strain and you hold it. Exactly, without 1 inch of slack, and without 1 pound of jerk, and the mud goes on thinking about it, and somewhere in there it starts to come, 1/8 of an inch at a time. And if the strain slacks for 1 second, it takes back everything it gave you. 4 saddle horses cannot do that. 20 saddle horses cannot do that. A horse on the end of a dally shifts his feet, and every shift is a jerk, and every jerk is a lie told to a rope. For 40 minutes, on a broken salt plate, in the middle of Dunmire County, a 340-pound grulla mare stood in a collar with her hind legs under her, and her neck long and her ears forward, leaning into a load she could not see the far end of, and did not move a foot. Not a step, not a shift. 40 men watched her stand there with the sweat running black down her shoulders and the tugs bar tight and her whole gray barrel roaring with the strain, calm as a church, adding and adding and adding. And out at the other end of it, in the mud, in the last of it, Hal Pruitt came up out of the ground with a sound that everybody on that bank heard and that not one of them ever managed to describe. Delia Bohannon got him onto the mudboat on his side and lashed him to it with his knees up and walked the plank road ahead of the drag, moving planks. And the mare walked him home 60 yards at about the speed of a man reading, and they took him off the boat on the sod at 14 minutes past 1 o'clock and put 4 coats on him and got whiskey into him, and he could not stand up for 2 hours. The first thing Hal Pruitt said, when he could say anything, was not about his brother, and was not about the mare, and was not about her. He said, "How many head are still in it?" That is the man he was, and you may as well know it now as later. It took them 3 days to get the rest of them out, and Delia Bohannon ran every hour of it. She never gave an order. She would say, "That is a good place for a trench," and 4 men would dig it. She would say, "We want plank, all the plank in this county," and Evo Mattoon put 12 mules on 2 high-wheelers and drove to Tolman in the dark, and came back at noon of the 19th with 200 feet of 2-inch fir off a lumber pile that he paid for out of his own pocket and never sent a bill for to anybody. Tobe Artery brought his crew and his hayrack and tore the top rails off Sherdlusk's corral, with Sherdlusk helping. Ab Doran brought rope. Somebody's wife sent out 4 hams. She taught 40 men to pull bog in 3 days. Lay your plank and spread your weight. Sling behind the front legs and never on the horns. Dig alongside and let the water in. Trench your anchor and lead the line out low. Take up the strain and hold it, and do not ever jerk it, because the ground is not fighting you, the ground is thinking about it. And put the leaning horse on the rope, not the jumping one. By dark on the 20th of September, they had brought 134 head of cattle up out of the chalk alive. There were 7 they did not get, and I am not going to write about those 7, except to say that of the 318 head that walked onto that flat on the morning of the 18th, 311 of them walked off it, and that on the morning of the 18th, there was not a man on that bank who would have bet you $1 on 100. They missed the cars. There was never a chance of the cars. The 11 spotted at Tolman for the 21st went to a man in Custer County, and Renfrew's June contract died on the 30th of September, and the Cross H shipped on the 6th of October at 2 7/8 and lost about $1,900 on the year, and Hal Pruitt paid his men out of the sale of a quarter section on the Loop, and did not lay one of them off. Orpha Pruitt came out to the flat on the 2nd day with a wagon. She brought coffee in 3 10-gallon cans and bread and a boiler of beans, and she set up on the North Rim and fed 40 men for 2 days, and she was 66 years old, and she stood in the wind on a salt flat from 6 in the morning until dark. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, when the last of it was up, and the men were coiling rope, she walked out to where Delia Bohannon was sitting on the tailgate of her own wagon, scraping blue mud off a plank with a spade. Delia stood up. Orpha Pruitt looked at her. Straight at her, in the face, for the first time in 3 years and 2 months. "I have handed you your mail 141 times, she said. "I counted it up last night. I could not sleep, and I counted it up, and it come to 141 times, and I never looked at you once. Mrs. Pruitt, I want to say the whole thing, and then I am going to go home." The old woman had her hands folded in front of her the same way Delia did, which neither of them had ever noticed. "I lost a boy in a river, and I could not carry it, and so I set it down on a horse. And after a while I set it down on you, because you was the one holding the horse. And I knowed better. That is the part I have got to say out loud in front of you. I knowed better the entire time. There ain't one thing wrong with that mare, and there never was, and I have known it since the November after, when Hal come home and told me about the spring under the bar. And I went on doing it anyway for 3 years, because it was easier to carry than the other thing." She reached out and took hold of Delia Bohannon's wrist, mud and all. "You come get your mail on Thursday," Orpha Pruitt said, "and you look at me while I hand it to you, and do not you dare be gentle about it." Delia sent her bill on the 28th of September. It was written on the back of a feed bill in pencil, because that was the paper in the house, and it read, 134 head, taken up out of the chalk, at $2 a head. $268. Hal Pruitt rode out to Spring Branch on the 2nd of October with $268 in an envelope, and he stood in her yard with his hat in his hand, and he had lost 11 pounds, and he was walking with a stick, and he was going to walk with one until March. "There is no line on here for me," he said. "No. Mrs. Bohannon, I have got money, and I have not got much else this fall, and I would like there to be a line on here for me." "There is no price on that," Delia Bohannon said. "I am not in that trade. I am in the other one." He stood there a while. "The lane is open," he said. "It has been open since the 19th. Ord took the wire off it, and I would take it kindly if you would use it, and I would take it kinder still if you would not thank me for it. Because it was mine to close, and it was a low thing, and I have got to live with having done it. All right. And I want to say the rest." He turned his hat around in his hands. "I have thought about it every hour since I come up out of that ground, and I have got it down to one thing. What I said to you at that gate was that she is right about everything except the times she ain't. And I meant it, and it sounded like sense, and it was the stupidest thing I have said in my life. Because I never once asked what the times were. Ma'am, I never asked you a single question about that horse in 3 years. Not one. I made up my mind about her in August of 1888, standing in a river bottom looking at my brother, and after that I only ever went looking for the parts that agreed with me. And every man in this county did the same thing, and when you dug that hole out there in July, we all of us took it like a gift." And Delia Bohannon, who had not said 200 words about that mare in 3 years, finally said them. "She is not a balker," she said. "A balker is a sour horse that will not go anywhere for anybody, and this mare has been hitched better than 3,000 times and has gone into everything I have ever pointed her at: water, snow, dark, fire smoke, a threshing engine, a bridge with a hole in it that I asked her to cross, and she crossed, because it would hold. She has stopped 19 times in 3 years. 12 of them I went back and found the reason, and I could take you to all 12 tomorrow. 6 of them I never found anything, and I have got to live with that, the same as you have got to live with yours. And one of them was on the chalk on the 17th of July, and I stood in a hole in it and told 11 men there was nothing there. And I was wrong. And I was wrong because I asked the ground the only question a spade can ask. Which is what? Whether it would hold 9 pounds, Delia said. My father has told me all my life. Ground does not answer a shovel, it answers weight. And it does not answer the weight you put on it. It answers the weight you put on it all at once. Hal Pruitt looked past her at the corral, where a big dark-faced gray mare was standing hip-shot in the sun, with her eyes half shut, doing nothing whatever, the way she had done nothing whatever for 3 years between the 14 minutes that mattered. 3 years, he said. 3 years, she said. And Mr. Pruitt, I have got to say my own part of it, because it is not all yours. You never asked me a question about her. I never once made you have to. I have sat in this county and let a thing be said about that horse 1,000 times, and answered it maybe 4, because I had decided that work talks, and I have found out this fall that work does not talk. Work has got no mouth at all. It is a fine thing to be a woman who does not explain herself. It cost me a trade, and it very near cost you your life, and if I had stood up in the schoolhouse in 1889 and said out loud what I have just said in this yard, I do not know that anybody would have listened. But I never made anybody not listen, either. I just went and got my mail and came home. Ord Tisdale rode out on the 4th of October and brought her the willow stake with the sun-bleached rag still knotted on the top of it. because he had gone out on the third day and pulled it up out of the crust before the freight teams could break it off, and he had carried it home across his saddle-bow like a lance and kept it in the bunkhouse for 2 weeks, not knowing what to do with it. She hung it on the harness room wall, above the row of oak pegs with the scraps of latigo on them. It hung there for the rest of her life. Zenas Halcombe lived through that winter and died in his bed on the 9th of February, 1892, at 74. And the last conversation his daughter ever had with him was about a buried plank and the right depth for a trench in sand, which was exactly the conversation he would have chosen. She was working again by the middle of October. She worked steadily for 21 years. In 1892, she had 2 teams and curly sipe on wages, and by 1896, she had 4 teams and a stock of 90 planks and a set of iron blocks out of Omaha, and she never did raise her price above $2 a head. Ivo Mattoon went on calling that mare the Judge until the day she died, and he made a point of it loudly in front of people. "I named her that for a joke 2 years before I understood one thing about her," he would say, "and I was righter than I had any business being, and I ain't giving it up now." Tobe Artery came out on the 11th of April, 1892, and hitched his team on the offside of hers to break out a swale on Spring Branch, and did it again the next day and the day after that. And in June he asked her a plain question standing in a meadow with his hat in his hand, and she said yes, and that is the whole of that, and I told you at the start you would not get more. Dove worked until she was 22, and then quit working and lived in the home pasture at Spring Branch until she was 28, which is a long life for a horse, and an unheard of one for a horse that 6 men in a sale yard would not bid on. Every fall for years, when the meadows got soft, Delia would go out and get her, and put the collar on her, and take her along, and mostly not use her. And the hands understood that this was not sentiment. There are jobs where you have to have a horse that will lean, and there are jobs where you have to have a horse that will refuse, and it is the same horse, and it has always been the same horse. That is the part Dunmire County never could get hold of, and it is the reason I have told you all of this at such length. They looked at an animal on the worst day of her life, and they wrote down what she was, and then for 3 years every single thing she did was read out of that first sentence, and the good she did got put in one room, and the name they had given her got kept in another. And no 2 facts in that whole county were ever allowed to walk into the same room and look at each other. A horse that will not go is a nuisance. A horse that will not move is the most valuable animal on the place. Those are the same horse. What a country calls worthless is almost never a thing without a use. It is only a thing whose one use has not come up yet. And the terrible part, the part that ought to keep a person honest, is that when it does come up, it will not come up gently. And it will not come up at a convenient hour, and it will come up somewhere out in the middle of 2¼ miles of white ground, where every man for 11 years has been certain, on the very best evidence he had, that there was nothing there at all.